Hello, and welcome to the Texas System of Care Cultural and Linguistic Competence Podcast. My name is Shannon Moreno, and I'm the CLC, or Cultural and Linguistic Competence Specialist with Texas System of Care. We continue our conversation with Dr. Regenia Hicks, Juvenile Probation Officer in the Health Services Division at Harris County Juvenile Probation in Houston, Texas. Dr. Hicks, we've been focusing a lot, and that's kind of the point of this whole podcast series is to focus on specific populations and, talk about that particular component of an individual's identity. But, the reality is when we talk about intersectionality, that there are many, many different factors that go into the specific identity of an individual and the ramifications that is going to have on their life experience. So today we've been purposefully and with reason focusing specifically on different strengths and different, systemic issues and interpersonal issues that members of the African American community may experience. But as we said in the very, very beginning of this podcast, there's a lot of diversity within this community. So in thinking about intersectionality, are there specific identities that in particular may have a difficult time or struggle or may face what can be referred to as maybe like marginalization within marginalization? So within the African American community, specific identities experiencing some forms of oppression or discrimination that workers should be aware of? That
intersection is so important because what you will see is those same challenges that we see being dealt with in the broader community, the larger community, majority community, however the term we want to use it right now. You also see played out within various communities of color and within the African American community as we're talking about today. So, some examples of that, as I talked about before, just in that clinical example of looking at mass depression or what it is that the bravado that you can oftentimes see within both young adults as well as youth as well as others in terms of not wanting to show that sign of weakness. You will also see what many people have identified, particularly in working with African American females, that whole concept of the superwoman, of this is being that strong Black woman who is going out and they're facing all the challenges and they're finding a way to be successful and the like, but are not being able to allow themselves the fact that they have a level of vulnerability in terms of being able to acknowledge that, particularly in terms of acknowledge that they are depressed. And I'm talking specifically about that intersection between gender and how those different gender expressions can come out and can sometimes be misunderstood and need to be addressed in a different way. I think when we're talking about the issues of the LGBTQ population, in many, particularly when I was mentioning that whole, one of those strengths has been in the African American community having a strong religious orientation when it comes to someone being gay or being lesbian, what that can mean based on what the orientation is of the particular religious following or teaching that they adhere to, will then come up being in very negative way in terms of very much marginalizing individuals who are having those issues. Going back again to looking at the whole thing as we had also mentioned about stigma about stigma as well. What it means for people who have had a criminal justice history, and whether or not that's something that comes with a different level of baggage, and whether or not that can be viewed in a way of being managed in a positive way or being managed within a negative way. So again, just to emphasize that the same conflicts or challenges or dynamics that we see interplaying in the broader community around people's differentness, you can oftentimes see that even heightened or exacerbated within how certain individuals from those different population groups then feeling their level of acceptance or not being accepted within the African American community.
And so there's this issue for young persons who may have specific intersectional identities of having those concerns within the African American community, but then also facing racism within the other communities that they are a member of because they're African Americans. So, speaking to your example of, young African American individual who identifies as being LGBTQ plus, they may face issues within their faith group community, intertwined very closely with facing issues within their African American community, but also within the LGBT community may face pretty explicit racism in regards to, dating, and, that's an issue that LGBT advocates have, been recently more and more open about, that there's a lot of issues of racism, or there can be a lot of issues of racism within that community. So if we think about this young person who is being hit from multiple levels of not being celebrated in larger society, and oftentimes not being safe in larger society, and then going to different community groups that they belong to and want to have close intimacy with and strong support with, but because of another piece of who they are, may face that discrimination or oppression. If workers don't have an understanding of that, then they're probably missing the whole boat when it comes to different behavioral health concerns that a young person may be facing. If the young person is presenting with depressive behaviors, or really any form of a behavioral health concern, and there's completely just an ignorance of the situation of that young person not feeling completely connected in any of their community groups they belong to, that's probably pretty problematic when it comes to actual services and treatment and assistance that is going to be beneficial for that young person.
Absolutely.
Well, Dr. Hicks, thank you again so much for the conversation today. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to check in and see if you had any last, topics you wanted to go over, or advice or encouragement for listeners. Just anything else that you'd like to say.
I think we covered. A lot of important things, and I guess the only other thought that comes to mind for me in terms of is kind of the wrap up of people finding their strength or their level of comfort to cross the chasm, to enter into this work, knowing that, not being afraid of making a potential faux pas, because we have always done that, and within that, just like we challenge the people that we're working with when we establish this therapeutic alliance, is that there probably isn't any one thing you can do in a day that is going to completely impact all of your your whole life, and that this too shall pass, so to speak, and so just for people to take that into these cross-cultural learning situations as they move forward, and and to seek this support. Knowledge is power, and so to continuing to challenge ourselves to be on that path to continue to learn and to continue to grow is what it's about to be human.
Genuinely, Dr. Hicks, thank you again so much for the conversation today. Really appreciate it. And I think that we got to delve into a number of different topics. So I so appreciate your time, your experience, your expertise, also sharing some of your personal experience as well. I hope that listeners enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed talking with you today.
I hope you enjoyed today's CLC podcast. If you have any questions on how to bring CLC initiatives into your local system of care community, please feel free to email us at info@txsystemofcare.org.